Okay, I just pulled up my slide deck. If anyone can't see it, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and get started. So depending on what time zone you're joining from, either good morning or good afternoon. My name is Robert Belcher. As Jim was saying, I am a Army officer, former Army officer. I spent 12 years in the service. 4 of those were as enlisted as a cavalry scout, and then 8 were as an officer on active duty. Worked in a variety of positions, all the way from companies and platoons up to supporting theater level armies and the Joint Chief of Staff. So I'm excited to now be using some of that experience to provide business intelligence and analysis in a different setting. So today I'm going to be going over my findings on XBEs in the United States. First, I'm going to go over the background information. So what the goal of this project is, why I think it's relevant, and the sources that drove my analysis. Second, I'm going to go over the information I collected on the XBEs, and I broke this down per category. So minority-owned business, women-owned business, veteran-owned, and disabled, as well as LGBT, and talk some about the overlap that exists between all these different categories, in which there is significant overlap. And finally, this presentation will end with a discussion of what the data means in terms of opportunities for us, as well as areas that I think further research will be useful. And Dr. Arnold will close us out with some important context on why this matters, and then we'll end with a period for everyone to ask questions. So for the goals themselves, this project started out, I was tasked over a month ago to examine XBEs in the United States, and it was a broad mandate, as I understood it, to look at the total number of businesses, as well as the characteristics of those businesses. And by that, I mean the size of the firms, the revenues, how they're structured, what industries they work in, whether or not they're certified, how they certified, number of years in business, et cetera. So my goal with that mandate was to build a presentation, which you're seeing today, which summarizes the findings. Although it is just a summary, there's much greater detail that exists in other products I've built, as well as to develop a white paper and to collect a body of data which we could use for further research on this topic, depending on where you think the research would best go next. So one of the first things I noticed when studying this was the extreme amount of proliferation of organizations that collect data on XBEs and provide certification to them. So there's a lot of groups that do this, ranging from the federal government, where you have institutions like the U.S. Small Business Administration. Most state governments provide it, city governments, some counties, lots of chambers of commerce. And then I think the most well-known would be the industry interest groups, of which there are many. The most famous one I have listed is the National Minority Supplier Development Council, and they have over 12,000 businesses that they list. And interestingly, when you pair this with the census data that I'm going to show you later, it shows that there is a gap that exists between the number that is certified and the number that are potentially out there. Because the census data would indicate that there's over 1 million firms that have employees that would fall into this category, yet only 12,000 fall into this largest certification authority. So there is a significant amount of businesses which are not certified and potentially missing out on benefits. So why this matters, I was kind of already alluding to this. It matters because the federal government since the 1960s and the Civil Rights Act has been trying to fix a long-standing problem where the business community doesn't accurately reflect population. So towards that, there's been a number of programs that have been put into place to assist and to direct more government contracts and resources to these disadvantaged companies. And one of them that I'm using as an example here is the Small Business Administration's 8A program. So to be eligible, the business just has to have 51% or more of its owners into one of these categories. And that definition holds true regardless of what certification board you're looking at. Most of them set the bar at 51% for whatever it is, whether they're certifying for minority-owned, veteran-owned, or woman-owned. And once the firm is certified in this program, it gives them access to a lot of assistance, funding, and I think most importantly, it gives them the ability to compete for sole source contracts. And the government is trying to diversify its supplier base. So currently they have 10% of the contract dollars going to firms in these diverse categories, but that's still very low and they want to increase it more. So this is really why certification matters. In order for the government to reach those goals and for the minority business community to expand, they have to be properly certified. It also helps other businesses know that they actually are really dealing with a diverse business, and they're not dealing with what's called in the literature a pass-through, a business that's designed to appear diverse while not actually being so in reality. So this is very important towards actually making progress and closing the gap between non-minority and minority-owned businesses. For the sources, when I started out, I did a review of the academic literature as well as looking at think tank materials and some of the industry papers. And the thing I quickly noted was they all refer back to the same sources, which come from the Census Bureau. So I went to what I felt was the best primary source, which is the Census Bureau documents. The number one that I used was the annual business survey. And this is something that's put out every single year by the Census Bureau, and it exists to collect data on businesses across the United States by sex, ethnicity, race, veteran status. And it's very useful because in addition to having those, it breaks down every single one of these businesses according to size of the firm, number of years in business, how they structure, so I can tell you whether it's family owned, whether the spouses jointly own it. It'll tell you all sorts of information about those firms. And the reason is because it's intended for use by government officials, entrepreneurs, academia, as well as industry in terms of understanding the business environment, specifically regarding these diverse businesses. And these reports are very well cited. You see them frequently used by other business organizations, like American Express, for example, puts out an annual state of women-owned business enterprises, and they rely solely on Census Bureau data for their products. So in doing this, I accessed 3 years worth of data, 2017, 18, and 19. And the thing you may note is all this data is prior to the COVID pandemic. And that's not a research choice of mine, it's by necessity. There's a lag in reporting. So the Census Bureau intakes the information and takes about 2 years to process the data before they release it. So they've only released the 2019 data this spring. You're not going to see the 2020 and 2021 data till next year, and potentially the year after for the 2021 data. In addition to those, for some of the historical snapshots, I used older Census Bureau products. So they had two of them. One is called the Survey of Business Owners. The other is the Annual Survey of Entrepreneurs. Both of these are discontinued, but they maintain the data available for researchers. So this allows you to look further back into time. So for those, I accessed 2002, 7, and 12, because that product was only done every 5 years. And for the annual survey, I accessed the 3 years that they did it. And they're very useful, but they are much older data. So for most of the figures you're going to see in here, those are coming from the most recent Census Bureau sources that are available. So before we go into detail on the individual categories of XBEs, I thought it'd be useful to have a baseline of population data from the 2020 census. And the reason why this is useful is it helps you see what numbers you would expect to see when you're thinking about the different categories of XBE. So in an environment like I propose exists, where there aren't formal legal barriers, you would expect to see a rough correspondence between the percentage in the population and the numbers that actually exist in the business. So for example, if in the United States, a combination of all minority groups makes up around 40% according to the last census, you'd expect to see the businesses be also somewhere within a few percent of that 40% number. Same for the number of women, and you'd expect that to be roughly half, and you'd expect the veterans to be at about 5%, because that is the number that exists within the census data. And the sad reality is that only veterans own anything near the proportion you'd expect based on population size. Veterans own about 8% of businesses in total, and then if you're looking at the number that actually have employees, it's about 6%. And the numbers at the bottom of the chart are showing you the total numbers as well as the percentages. And I'm going to go into greater detail on each of these numbers on the individual slides. I'm just showing you here to draw attention to the mismatch. So for example, the percentage of women-owned businesses is 38%. So it's 9 million, or excuse me, 12 million, 38%. But that's 12% lower than you'd expect. And the number of minority owned is 28% at 9 million roughly. And that is also 12% lower than you'd expect. So this does show that while progress has been made over time, there still exists a large gap that remains to be closed. And now we'll move on to more detail on the individual numbers. So for the deep dive, we're going to start off with minority-owned businesses. And for each slide, I'm going to move from left to right on the graphics and using them to illustrate the points. So for figure 1, what we're showing here is the change in minority-owned businesses over time from 2002 to 2019. And it shows a steady growth, which when you average these numbers, it equals about 20% per year that I put into the chart. And it shows an overall growth from 2002 to present of 71%. So based on the most recent census data, there are around 9 million total minority businesses in the United States, of which a little over 1 million actually have employees. Figure 2, I'm showing the breakdown of industries for MBEs. The actual census data takes you all the way from 1 to 20, but I'm just showing you the top ones here. And the thing I'd like to note is just that the non-minority ones tend to be in higher revenue categories. As an example of this, look at the placement in the two charts of the professional, scientific, and technical services category, which is high revenue. It's number 1 in non-minority, whereas number 4 in minority-owned. For figure 3, I'm depicting the balance between minority, non-minority, and jointly owned employer firms. And the key thing here is that, once again, it's not in balance with what you'd expect on population size. Currently, 19% are minority-owned, 2% are jointly owned, and 79% are non-majority, which is a pretty large gap. Figure 4 shows you one example of what you can do with the data looking at specific industries. So I picked manufacturing because it's one that generates a lot of revenue, and it's one that shows an even bigger gap than exists with the overall numbers. So the takeaway here is that in some fields, the gap between MBE and non-MBE is even bigger than you would see with the overall numbers. In manufacturing, MBEs are only 11% of businesses in that industry. And figure 5 shows some of the intersections that exist between all these different categories of MBE. So in this case, 28% of MBEs also would fall into your WBE category. They're owned by a female. And additionally, you have 13% that are equally male and female owned. And in a lot of these cases, you're talking about husband and spouse that own, and some of them are franchise or family-owned businesses. For women-owned businesses, figure 6 depicts the change over time, and it also shows a steady growth, but it's lower than the growth rate for minority-owned. It ends up averaging out to about 12% between each of these census years, and 48% total change from 2002 to 2019. And based on the most recent Census Bureau data, there's around 12 million WBEs in the United States, of which a little over 1.2 million have employees on their payroll. Figure 7 shows the top industries. And the main takeaway here is that they're in slightly higher revenue fields when compared to MBE. Most notably, they have the professional, scientific, and technical services being higher, as well as they have healthcare, number 2, which is also a high revenue field. Figure 8 shows the balance between women, non-women, and joint. One interesting thing to note here, and this is different than the case with MBEs, is that there's a larger number of firms that are the Census Bureau classifies as equally male, equally female. In this case, that is 15%, which compared to minority owned is only 2%. Figure 9 shows some of the fields. As an example, I'm using healthcare. And in this case, it's actually fairly close to parity. It's close to where you'd expect the numbers to be. 35% are female-owned, 10% are joint, 55% are male. So still room for improvement, but it's much closer to what it should be than the overall numbers actually are. And lastly on this, figure 10 shows another one of those intersections between our categories. And in this case, only 4% of women-owned businesses would actually fall into the veteran category. And this is very low compared to the number of female veterans. But one possible reason for this is that the older cohorts of veterans were less diverse, more male. And as you see more millennials and Gen Z moving into the business population, this probably will correct over time. Veteran-owned business enterprises. This is near and dear to me as a former veteran. Figure 11 shows the growth over time as well. And the growth rate here is much slower. It's only 4% from start to now. But they are the only one of these categories that actually does match with what you'd expect based on population size. They tend to be in very high revenue industries, with the number one being professional, scientific, and technical services, two being construction, which is high revenue, and three being healthcare. When you look at, like as I was saying before, where their total number in comparison to population, they're 6% veteran owned, 3% jointly owned, and 91% non-veteran. So when you combine those two, it's at 9%, which is 4% over what you'd expect based on their percentage of population. And there's an interesting Syracuse University study from 2020 that goes into greater detail on this if anyone's interested, for why perhaps veterans are more entrepreneurial than the general population. But one statistic of note from it is it says 15% of veterans open businesses compared to 11% of non-veterans. Figure 14 shows how in some fields veterans are overrepresented. So this is the high revenue producing professional, scientific, and technical field. And in this case, they're up to 9% when you combine firms that they own solely, as well as firms that they jointly own with non-veterans. And then the last one here shows the intersection of some of these other categories. So 10% of veteran business enterprises also fall into the minority owned. And this is also low compared to the number of minority veterans. So it's a potential gap that should be addressed, where not quite sure why they wouldn't be opening. But one potential explanation for why this number is similar to with female veterans, the current population of millennial and Gen Z are far more diverse. So this could end up correcting itself over time as well. Moving on to disabled owned business enterprises. I'm not able to show you the same charts for this because the Census Bureau doesn't collect data in the same way it does for the other XBEs. This does not show up at all in any of the three sources that I use, so I had to try to go about collecting it indirectly. And the two things that I use to try to infer the rough size we're talking about is you can see the number of service disabled veterans, which is about 34,000. And you can also see within the census data from what they call the annual community survey, the number of business executives with disabilities. And the last year that there was data for that, it's about 59,000. Now, you can't just add those together and think that that's the total number, because it's likely to be more than this. But it does give you a sense of what scale we're talking about. We're probably talking about somewhere between 100 and 200,000 that would fall into this category. There are a lot of certification boards that you can try to add up numbers from. But as I said, when I was talking about, minority owned, they only capture a fraction of the number of businesses that are out there. And from what I saw, the number of DBE sources, it's not as robust as finding for veteran, minority, or women owned. And some states maintain databases for this. Like I counted the number that Indiana had at over 12,000, which also gives you a sense of the scale likely for the total United States. But this is an area that I think further research would be needed. Moving on to LGBT. This is similar to with the last category. The Census Bureau doesn't track this. They don't track sexual identity really in any of their products. So you're not able to really use the Census Bureau to give you exact figures and breakdown per industry in the same way you are with some of the other ones. So for this, I use data from the National LGBT Chamber of Commerce, and they estimate that there's 1.2 million businesses that would fall into this category. And in that case, they're almost certainly talking about total number of businesses rather than employer firm, because employer firm is typically much smaller than the total number. But I'm unable to independently verify it, so I'm citing it as the best number available, but not a lot of fidelity on it. And for their certification, they only list 1,800 businesses. So when you compare that to what we know from minority owned, where their largest certification board lists 12,000, comparison to the 1.1 million that could exist according to Census Bureau data, it's likely an undercount. There's likely a lot of room for additional LGBT businesses to be certified and to have access to the funds that they would deserve. And finally, there's an additional issue with this category where, due to personal privacy issues, not everyone would openly identify. So that's something that affects this in a way that it doesn't really affect collecting data for veteran status. So overall, what I'm trying to show here is that the total numbers have changed over time, as I've discussed on the individual category slides. And the key point here is while there is growth in every single category in absolute terms, it's not really leading to a relative gain that allows them to catch up to the non-diverse businesses. So while MBEs increased 71% over time, WBEs increased 48%, they're still not in line with the number you'd expect based on the population. In both 2002 and 2019, there's a gap. MBEs have only 20% of employer firms, but it should be around 40% based on population. Women are only around 22%. Once again, it should be around 50%. And only veterans are actually in line with what you'd expect based on the population size. And one stat that I'm citing here, but there's many you could go with, the U.S. Minority Business Development Agency estimates at this current rate, it's going to take at least 70 years to close this gap. I've seen numbers that are larger, numbers that are smaller. Point being, regardless of which number you take, it's a long time and we're a long way from being where we should be. So for the opportunities that I see coming out of this, one is I think it really shows the utility of having an XBE certification, because many of the organizations have a definition which gears towards 51% in one group, so women, veteran, minority. But the census data shows that there's a large number of businesses that will have owners from multiple categories. So those may not necessarily be showing up, but they are diverse businesses. If you have one that's, 3 partners, one African-American veteran, one, white non-Hispanic veteran, and a female, that may not show up in these other categories, but I would argue that's extremely diverse. Also, it shows, I think, the need for more certifications in general, because there is this gap between the number that likely exist and the number that are able to fully take advantage of the opportunities and the money that's available for them. And then finally, the gap that exists, it shows opportunity for further growth in all these categories. Finally, for what I think should be done in terms of further research, with veterans, Syracuse University, in partnership with the Census Bureau, has a really good product looking at the challenges that they face, why they go into business. And this really helps people to determine why there is a gap and then what can be done to help close that gap. So I think having a questionnaire geared towards either minority, women, LGBT, one of these other categories would be very useful, because it would help actually answer some of these questions, and test between the different hypotheses for why there is this gap. Number 2, I think that there needs to be additional research on 2 of the categories, LGBT and disabled, because we're not able to really give the same fidelity of answer we are with minority, women, and veteran. And then finally, gathering this was challenging because there really isn't one central authority of this that I saw. So I think if there was a portal that housed a lot of this data, that'd be very useful for other researchers working on improving diversity. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Arnold, which will talk more about why all this matters.
So if you would please just stay in the driver's seat for me. I only have a couple of slides to look at. Thank you. I appreciate it. Sure. So before I go into this, I just want you all to take this number, 333, and just kind of inculcate that into your spirit, and I'll address it a little later. But if you'll just take a look at a few statistics. These statistics come from a study done by the Michigan Minority Supplier Development Council. And in this study, they show us here that in 2018, people of color represented 40% of the U.S. population. And here we're talking about.
I am calling from Utah, but I'd like to have my son.
Okay. This is referring to revenues. The revenues from the MBEs, and these are minority businesses, representing only 9.4% of the revenues by private U.S. firms. And this is another comparison to our white firms. During the pandemic, in case you thought that the pandemic was the only problem, the pandemic just exacerbated a situation that already existed. So our Black-owned businesses were impacted more severely And you can see the statistics here. Black-owned businesses were down 41%, Latinx businesses down 32%, and our Asian counterparts were down by 26%. And in comparison to our white-owned businesses, the firms declined by only 17%. You can take a look at the statistics for 2014 to 2018. There was a 1.25% increase of MBEs that generated $1 million in revenue. And the increase was only 8.8 to 9.4% during the same period of time. You go to the next slide, please. So we'll talk about why. If you just take a look at this again from the same study, it's estimated that by 2045, people of color will make up more than 50% of U.S. population. And taking a look at this, all of the companies that aren't responsive to helping our MBE spending will more likely be left behind. So this study suggests that this is an additional incentive for increasing our MBE spending growth. Now, this is where things get really interesting. Take the next slide, please. 333. It will take 333 years to achieve economic equity for minority-owned businesses with white-owned firms at our current growth rate. That is astounding. But the news isn't so bad because it is something that's very easily, at least theoretically, remedied if all of our corporations would increase their MBE spend by 1%. This problem can be resolved in 15 years. And here's the interesting thing, and this is just my my editorial at the end. For some reason in this country, we don't choose to address issues until we reach a precipice. My concern is what abyss we'll be staring down when we reach the precipice before we decide to do something. Because one way or another, something is going to result from this severe disparity. And throughout history, we know what happens when the masses don't get what they need. I thank you all for your time, and I appreciate and welcome any